This week's Parsha is Chaye Sarah, which records the passing of Sarah. It records the Avram sending out his trusted servant Eliezer to find a wife for Rivka. And it records the Avraham passing out of the world. Goes over the genealogy of Yishmael, the estranged, non-inheriting son of Avram. And then next week, we're going to move on to the life of Yitzchak, his son. What we're going to look at tonight is chapter 24. And although I didn't check it definitively, it's probably the longest chapter in the book of Bereshit. It's 64 sentences, more than that, I think. It's focused exclusively on finding a wife for Yitzchak. So just to pick up the narrative for a moment, the previous Parsha ends with the offering of Isaac, the binding of Isaac. He's offered on an offering as an offering. God stops Abraham from doing so, the ultimate test of allegiance, testing both Abraham and Yitzchak. And then by tradition, the bridge to this week's Torah reading is that somehow it was learning about the offering of Isaac that shocked Sarah into passing away at the age of 127, which means Abraham was 137. They were 10 years apart in age. And it causes Abraham to turn his attention to finding a proper wife for Yitzchak, his son, who at this point would be 37 years old. Now, chapter 24, I want to just point out the structure of it. We're going to look at three distinct sections of the chapter. Basically, sentences 2 through 9, which is Abraham instructing his servant Eliezer to go back to the place of his birth, which is Haran, up in the north in Syria, and to find a suitable wife and bring that wife back to be married to Yitzchak. Then the next section, basically sentences 10 to 28, tells us what happened. Eliezer traveled back there, goes to the well, sets up a test to determine who would be the proper girl. Rivka appears. He sees that she is, in fact, designated as the wife of Yitzchak, gives her gifts, and then he goes to her family, her father, mother, and brother, and then he ends up in a lengthy way recounting the events, and that sentence is 34 all the way through 49. And we have a long conversation of Eliezer explaining to them what happened at the well, which we already know because we had an account of what really happened in what I'm calling is section 2. So section 1 is Avram's instructions. Section 2 that we're going to focus on is what actually happened. And section 3 is the manner in which Eliezer retells the story and ultimately gets the blessing of Rivka and her father, her brother and mother. And the father disappears from the story. We won't discuss that. And then he heads back, all the way back to unite Rivka with her husband Yitzchak. And in fact, at the end of chapter 24, they are married, they are together, and the mission is accomplished. Now, clearly, we're dealing with a very critical moment in the history of the Jewish people here, a critical decision that had to be made, because marriage is considered very serious to the Jewish people throughout history. And this is the first time that in order to continue the spiritual legacy of the Jewish people, a marriage has to be arranged, has to take place so that there can be continuity of the family. And clearly that's what's on Avram's mind, the father in this case, because he just came close to offering his son Yitzchak, the one and only heir, spiritual heir he had, as an offering, which would have ended the possibility of there being any future generations. And we know from lengthy discussions in Lech Lecha 2 weeks ago and last week, having a child and having the legacy of Avram continue was foremost in Avraham's mind and psyche. And it wasn't that his own service of God wasn't important in and of itself. It certainly was. But it was clear from the get-go, the way that God interacted with Avram was that he was meant to create a spiritual legacy to run all the way through history. And obviously, in order to do that, marriage has to take place so that Yitzchak can have a family. We'll go through a similar situation later when Jacob meets his wife to be at the wells, echoes of this week's Torah reading. And it continues all the way through. We have many accounts going forward of marriages taking place and people finding one another and therefore continuing the legacy of the Jewish people. It's a central feature throughout the Torah, and we can isolate it and go all the way through the Torah from beginning to end, practically from really beginning to end. But we're not going to do that tonight. What we are going to look at is we're going to take points of view. Whenever we have a story retold, or actually in this case, it's a string, and I want to just organize that in your minds. Hopefully in my mind, it's already organized, although it may not seem that way at this moment. Avraham has a plan, and he conveys that plan in instruction form to Eliezer. Eliezer goes, follows the general plan, adding his own details, and executes the plan and finds Rivka at the well in Haran, quite a distance away. And then clearly from the get-go, the challenge is going to be now for phase 3 to take place, which will be for Eliezer to convince Rivka herself and to convince her family that this is a great idea, even though Yitzchak is not on the scene. They didn't have the chance to meet on the internet, and therefore to be able to willingly and wholeheartedly bring her back to become the second matriarch of the Jewish people. So there's 3 points of view here. At least 3, but there are 3 we're going to focus on. There's the point of view of Avraham in the instructions he gave. There's the point of view of Eliezer, who is the servant, the messenger, carrying out those instructions and doing all he can to make the mission successful. And then there's going to be the point of view of Rivka's family, which we're going to get into, in terms of listening to what's taking place and agreeing to send Rivka on her way. Now, points of view are very, very important because, after all, the idea of being a servant of God ultimately means that we as a human being can come close to understanding the point of view of God and fulfill that will and that viewpoint and be the ambassadors of God in the world. So for us to do that, it requires us understanding, given the gap between human beings and God, how the best way we can understand and implement God's perspective on what's right and what's wrong and carry that out in the world. And we know that even with a great deal of sincerity, it can become very confusing. And we live at a time today where there are multiple points of view, and oftentimes those multiple points of view lead people to conclude that therefore there is no such thing as right and wrong, there is no such thing as obligation or moral commitment, and we're going to try to see through that haze in the course of this class as we look at this. Now, what we are going to focus in on is we're going to focus in on most especially on discrepancies that are going to take place. We're going to see discrepancies between what Avraham tells Eliezer and seemingly the way he understands it, discrepancies between the way he executes it, and more discrepancies in the way he retells the story and presents it to Rivka's brother and mother in order to have them agree to send her on her way and allow her and give their blessing, which they do give, to her marrying Yitzchak. So these are the three interlocking pieces that we're going to try to look at. And just a word, first of all, about discrepancies. If a person is sincere, then a person tries to resolve discrepancies. If a person is not sincere, you dismiss the discrepancies as being showing that something's not authentic. If you and I are becoming friends and I see inconsistencies in the way you look at the world or the way you treat person A compared to person B, so I have a few things I can do. I can dismiss you as a person and say you're a phony, you're a hypocrite, and let you go. Or I can try to understand you. I could engage you in conversation. I could perhaps spend time with you in other circumstances. And as I come to understand you better and know you, I could resolve these discrepancies. So when it comes to the Torah itself, we live in an age which probably started a little bit more than 200 years ago, where any inconsistency in the Torah is just a proof that it's not authentic. It was patched together, that there were many authors. Everybody has their ideas. And there's very little, if any, effort made. It's sort of like, I discovered an inconsistency. So it shows you the book was written by people who were illiterate. They couldn't really write it down, whatever great theory I want to make up, or it's been changed, or it's been re-edited. But we know from Jewish tradition and that we resolve and we learn from discrepancies. And it's just like if I want to understand you, I could probably gain the biggest and deepest insights into understanding you by understanding why you treated Mr. A in a way that seems to contradict the way you treated Mr. B. And if I find out that you have reasons for that, and what seems like an inconsistency, in fact, is consistent, then I really understand you much better. And hopefully we're going to do that now in looking at chapter 24 in the Torah. Now, it's too long a narrative for us to read it, even though I know Frank is standing by. We're on page 109 in the Stone Chumash. That's where chapter 24 begins. But let's just do a quick outline of what takes place. Avram summons Eliezer and says, I want you to travel to the place of my birth, and I want you to find there a suitable wife for my son Yitzchak, and you are to bring her back here, and in no way, shape, or form is my son to go leave the land of Canaan ever, and certainly not to be involved in this mission. Eliezer asked the obvious question to Avram, what happens if the girl doesn't want to come? Says, in that case, you're absolved, and we'll come up with plan B. Fine. Then Eliezer sets out on his way. He's fully empowered and charged. He has wealth of his master, Abraham. He has everything he believes to represent him well. Travels back to the place. He creates a scenario which he verbalizes to God, and it's all part of the narrative here. He actually says to God, we're going to devise a method of understanding who the right girl is. Someone's going to approach me. This person's going to give water to myself, to the camels. I'm going to see that this is the person who's meant to be the wife of Yitzchak. Ultimately, that takes place. He's excited. He thanks God. He bestows presents on the girl, asks her who she is, and then goes to her family's home. Before they wine and dine him, this will be phase 3. The family, he says, nope, before we eat anything, before we have a nice celebratory meal, I want to describe to you exactly what's taking place. And here he recounts the narration with significant changes in what took place. And we're going to look at those. And then we're going to understand what was going on in this whole story and why that's the case. So if you look at the text, we'll look at sentences 1 and 2. Now, Avram was old, well on in years, and Hashem had blessed Avram with everything, and everything here, Rashi says, means a son, meaning that he had a spiritual heir, which he had longed for so many years, and that heir is still alive. And Avram said to his servant, the elder of his household, who controlled all that was his, place now your hand upon my thigh. I mean, it's a way of making an oath. And I will have you swear by Hashem, God of heaven, God of earth, that you not take a wife from my son, from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. Rather, to my land and to my kindred shall you go, and take a wife from my son from there. Servant says, perhaps the woman won't want to come, and we know the rest of the story now. A striking feature of chapter 24, with its great length, is that what's missing is the name of this servant. And Eliezer has been named many times before in the Torah. As a matter of fact, in a very touching moment where Abraham is despairing of ever really being the father of a child, he sort of says, well, maybe my servant Eliezer will be my spiritual heir and will carry on Judaism. And God says, nope, it will be a child born of you and Sarah. That's who will carry on the heir. So Eliezer is certainly a lofty person. He's never mentioned by name. When he introduces himself to the girl at the well, he doesn't mention his name. He identifies himself simply as Eved Avraham Anochi. I am the servant, a servant of Abraham, completely identifying himself in his relationship to Abraham. And then throughout the whole narrative, his name doesn't appear even once. He's always referred to as the Eved or the Eved of Abraham. Question why that is, okay? And I want to ask a second question, which doesn't fit in with the text, but I think it's a general question, which we will resolve, but I think it's a striking question. And the question is this. Avram is doing what? He's living in the land of Canaan, the promised land, and he is teaching people through his kindness, through his disposition, through his circumcision, how to recognize themselves as children of God, created in God's image, and how to serve God properly, how to push aside idolatry. And in fact, according to certain Midrashic accounts, Avram has had a widespread, decisive impact on the people around him, to the extent that he has a household consisting of hundreds, thousands of people. We don't really know how many, but it's a huge size. And he's identified as the Prince of God by the kings in the region, and in Lech Lecha. So Avram already has a foothold in the world, and that foothold is in the land of Canaan. I would think, that when it comes time to marry off, to find a suitable wife for your son, you would say, these are my people. These are people who have been with me. Eliezer's been with me for decades already. He's my trusted servant. I've got all these other people who have given up idolatry, who are part of my household, who I've developed a trust in, who I've gone to war with. What would be the idea of no one from here is going to marry my son? It has to be from there. It's a surprising move, and so we're going to try to resolve that also. So we're looking at points of view and understanding the perspective of people. We're going to try to understand why Eliezer is nameless in this entire chapter, and we're also going to understand why Abraham is intent on his son not marrying from amongst his disciples and his students and his household, but rather going back to the place that he originated from, which will be a striking thing. But let's look at the inconsistencies now. Number one, it's odd that Eliezer is not mentioned. We're going to call, we'll try to number them, and we'll try to refer back to them that way. Number two, when Avram instructs Eliezer, he instructs him specifically, go to the place of my birth. Now, it's also ironic, because after all, didn't God start off by saying, Lech lecha mi'artzecha mi'moladetecha? God told Abraham, I want you to leave, separate yourself, put in your past the land of your birth and the people, your family. And now Abraham is going back there. Another inconsistency. Avram, in his instructions in part 1, is very clear to Eliezer that you are not to consider a marriage partner for my son from the children of Canaan. Avram never mentions that. Eliezer never mentions that, neither to Rivka at the well, nor does he bring it up with the family. And even the issue that Yitzchak is not allowed to leave the land of Canaan, and therefore, when I'm summoning your daughter to come back to the land of Canaan and marry him, it means she will never return back to you. That's not mentioned. That's an inconsistency. Issue number 4. Eliezer seems to create this scenario on his own, without specific instructions from Abraham, that we're going to encounter a girl at the well, and if she will take her cod, her water barrel, and if she will give water to me, and if she will give water to the animals, then we will be certain that she is destined to be the wife of Yitzhak. Now we know that divination, sorcery, is prohibited by the Torah, and yet this sounds like it. And in fact, whenever there is a halachic discussion of how sorcery works, which has some complexities to it, it's very clear that sorcery involves, if I wake up in the morning and say, if a black cat walks across my path, I'm going back home and I'm not going to do the business I planned to that day because that's a bad omen. That person's violating the Torah's prohibition on sorcery. Question, is Eliezer violating that? Also, the manner in which Eliezer sets up the test is inconsistent in what actually happens at the well, where he says that this girl will give water to me, and then she will give water to the camels, and the way he tells it to the family of Rivka, where he lumps them together and says, and said, I said to her, you will give water to me and to my camels, which he never did originally. That's an inconsistency. A big inconsistency. This is number 5, between what really happened at the well and what he tells the family of Rivka. When you look in between sentences 10 and 28 here, you will see that the minute Rivka finished pouring the water for the camels, having first given water to Eliezer, he immediately says, this is the girl, Baruch Hashem, and he gives her gifts. And these gifts, by the way, are really betrothal items to betroth her to Yitzchak as a wife. When he retells the story, he does not tell the story accurately. And he says specifically, I asked the girl, who are you? And she said, I am the daughter of Besuel, who and related to Abraham. It comes out, I'm part of his family. And then I gave her the gifts. So is Eliezer lying? What is the reason? What's going on here that he doesn't accurately present to them what actually took place as the Torah describes it? And the 6th discrepancy we'll hold off on for right now. It's a nuance of discrepancy. I'll mention it to you, but only for those people who are really into the text. If you look at sentence 5 in chapter 24, when Eliezer raises the issue, perhaps the girl will not want to come back with me, he uses the word ulai, which is the correct word for perhaps, and it's spelled correctly, Aleph Vav Lamed Yud. And then when he repeats it over in phase 3, as he's talking to Rivka's family, you read it the same word as Ulai Aleph Lamed Yud. This is in sentence 39, but the Vav is missing. Why discrepancy in the manner in which the Torah wrote it down? So with these questions in mind, and with the idea that we want to dig into the points of view that are represented here, let's put forward a thesis, okay? In part 1, when Avraham chooses Eliezer for this mission and this job, Avraham understands that Eliezer is his trusted disciple. Eliezer has developed a worldview which is as close to Avraham's as anybody else alive in the world view is. Therefore, since Avraham knows who he is sending, he doesn't have to give Eliezer, the servant, specific instructions. He leaves it to Eliezer, and reliant on the idea that Eliezer shares with Avraham a basic idea, which is elucidated not in the Torah, but in very specific commentaries, which is the reason Avraham wanted a wife, not from the Canaanim, but rather from going back to the place of Haran, where his family had resided, was because Avraham felt, I would rather have my son marry a girl whose family is steeped in idolatry and has not come under the influence of my teachings, but one whose nature is kindly and good in essence, because that's a more basic quality, and and her lack of education that I provided people in terms of seeing through idolatry and coming to believe in God is secondary. A real wow idea. The Ron puts this forward. The Ron is a commentary who wrote lengthy discourses amongst his other writings in the 14th century. And the Ron says explicitly, we understand from this story, the whole premise of this story is that Avram says, the people of Canaan have a character defect. And even though I'm teaching them to know God, and even though I'm bringing them under God's shelter and wing, so to speak, and even though they become people attaching themselves to me and giving up idolatry and living lives of kindness, I understand that this will not take root deeply within their souls, because as a people, they tend not to be kindly and not to be sensitive to helping other people. Therefore, in a moment of decision to find the matriarch to succeed my wife, Sarah, and to build the future of the Jewish people, the priority is to see past those quote unquote superficial differences and to look at the essence of the girl. And therefore, you're going to go back to the place of my birth. And Eliezer understands that the test, the manner in which he'll be able to determine is this potential marriage partner for Yitzhak suitable, will be the extent to which he's a kindly, giving person. And finding that person even in the household of idolatry, even in the household of people who are devious, but if she has this embedded in her character that it defines her essence, then that's the one who's going to be the wife for my son Yitzhak, and she will be the true matriarch, able to take over for Sarah and able to be the next link in the chain. So this is an amazing story when you look at it in this context. When you realize this insistence on the part of Avram Avinu that a wife not come from the people of Canaan and not come from the families of his most trusted servants and disciples and friends, but rather would come from the quote unquote unwashed people back in Haran, but be given the fact that those are people whose essence and whose core is built on kindliness and sensitivity and doing for others, that carries the day. And that's the lesson the Ron digs out from these stories. And this thesis is going to answer many, if not all, of the questions we've raised here. And it's going to make these three stories fit together perfectly. So let's see how that works. So let's look at the question about divination and sorcery, which is the halachic question here. So we understand fully that when Eliezer comes to the place of Haran and he goes to the well and he speaks out to God and says, the young woman who is going to come forward and who's going to offer water to me and offer water to the camels, this woman will be the proper successor matriarch of the Jewish people. So he creates this character test, as the Ron puts it. It has nothing to do with sorcery. It's not saying if somebody comes out with a red dress with a purple bow on the left shoe and a green bow on the right shoe, that would certainly be divination. That would be the antithesis of anything that would be upbuilding of the household of Abraham. He devises this test. And in fact, it's not that Rivka passes the test, it's that she surpasses the test. Because when you look And what Rivka does is when Rivka approaches them, and this is the details in section number 2, what really happened, Rivka first simply says, let me give you water. Now, at that moment, she seems to be failing the test, because what about the animals? Eliezer says, great. And she gives him the water. And he drinks water until his fill. And only once she sees that the people involved have been satisfied and their thirst has been slaked, then does she say, now on her own, she says, I'm going to go back and get more water so that your animals also can drink. So what is she doing here? She's acting with kindness, but she's differentiating the kindness that's owed to a fellow human being as compared to the responsibility to lower forms of life, to the camels that also are thirsty. And she didn't want to lump them together. So when Eliezer set up this idea, well, she'll give to me and to the camels, Rivka surpasses that and says, I'm first going to be sensitive to you as a human being. First of all, I don't want you to drink less, figuring that I'm not going to bring more water for the camels. So I'll make a commitment. I want you to drink as much as you want. If that involves 1 trip, 2 trips, 3 trips to the well, you've traveled a long distance, tell me when your thirst has been quenched. He does that. And then she volunteers and says, okay, now I'm going to continue being in this kindness. She doesn't put it that way, but I'm going to meet the needs of your animals as well, superseding what he really told her, and doing it in a manner which will add more dignity to the character of Eliezer himself, and which showed her understanding that human beings are not packages of chemicals, but that in fact they have a quality to them that's deserving of special dignity and respect. So she more than passes the test. However, and now we're going to look at the manner in which Eliezer deals with retelling the story and what we're calling here phase 3, sentences 34 through 49. Eliezer understands that her family being involved in idolatry goes for the idea of divination and sorcery. And therefore, when he retells the story to them, he alters the story and makes it sound as though, you know, I was looking for some kind of sorcerer's sign that this was the right girl, knowing full well that such an approach would convince them more deeply that, in fact, she was destined to marry this fellow Yitzhak, who they're not going to meet, but the heir of Abraham and all the wealth and everything else. This also explains why Eliezer doesn't say, I was proscribed from marrying him off to anybody from Canaan, and I was sent to go to the place of his birth, but rather makes it all about family and the idea that he's Avram, and here is a change, a discrepancy. It says Avram sent me back to his family. Now again, he's not lying here, because family, in the sense that people who also are imbued with kindness and chesed, is the essence of who they are as people, just like the Ron explained to us. So, and Eliezer retells the whole story from the vantage point that it's about family and association and connection. And you who subscribe to idolatry and who believe in omens and signs, there's an omen and a sign here also that this girl is meant for Yitzhak. So on your own terms, you should endorse her coming and realize that she needs to go back. And then here we'll answer the final 2 questions. The idea of the missing vav, ulai or ulai without the vav. When Eliezer tells the story over to the family of Rivka, where his whole goal is to take on their point of view and perspective on the world, and to say, I want to convince you from where you are today that your daughter Rivka is destined to be the matriarch of the Jewish people and to marry a Yitzhak. I'm going to do it with your terminology. And here he reveals something to them, although very subtly, by leaving out the vav, and he says, Ulai, I told my master, maybe the girl won't want to come back, which he does report to them. He leaves out the vav and indicating that I have a daughter of my own, and I would love to have my daughter married to my master's son. Okay, but that's not what my master's instructions were to me. He wanted me to go back to the family, which is all true and accurate, but he presents it in a way which is going to make the family of Lavan and Bethuel, the parents of Rivka, feel as though, wow, this is all tailor-made for us. It's as if Abraham wanted our daughter to marry his son, and he sent the servant for that reason, even though the instructions were more broad. But once Eliezer sees the picture form in front of him, he's able to address them from their point of view. He's able to deal with Rivka from the point of view of, I'm going to give you, I don't even know your name, but I'm going to give you these presents right now, instantaneously, because I see your character. And I see your character as that of the perfect person to be married to Yitzchak. And that's what brings Rivka into the picture, because Rivka sees from the spontaneity, from the manner in which Eliezer responds to her act of kindness, that her essence is exactly what she's going to bring to this marriage and what's going to ultimately build the future of the Jewish people. And the final point we haven't explained is this. Why is Eliezer's name not mentioned here? Because Eliezer has no stake in what's going on. The only real stake he had on a personal level is hoping it would fail and nobody would come back with him. And then maybe his daughter would again somehow come into the running. And maybe there'd be a possibility by default that she would marry Abraham. And he completely pushes that aside. And not only does he push it aside, but he uses that detail as another way of communicating to the family of Rivka that what a great opportunity this is for their family to reunite with their kinsman Abraham, and for Rivka to become a matriarch in a wealthy, known, illustrious family, which has wealth and which has respect, and which the gods, quote unquote, have endorsed this marriage. Now, and that's why Eliezer's name doesn't appear here, because Eliezer is not a salesman and he's not a manipulator. And it's only because he has no skin in the game and no personal agenda here, and it's the opposite, he's overriding his personal agenda, that he even has the right to talk to each person purely from their own point of view. Because you see, if I want to impact the world, if I need to understand a simple idea, chanoch l'nar al pi darko, educate a child according to the child's way. What does that mean? It means that we as parents, we need to understand our children where they are at, whether it's Legos being their whole reality, or at a certain point when they're teenagers being so unable to control impulse, or as they mature. We need to find a way not to manipulate them, but to spur their growth and their development, to understand them for who they really are, what their essence is, what their perspective is, and what ideas and what ways can I introduce to them, and how can I take the Torah and the legacy of Avraham Avinu and bring it into their lives where they are at today, so that they can grow and they can become part of this grand picture of tikkun olam and of rectifying the world. So Eliezer is doing something magnificent here. He's able to fully comprehend the vision of Abraham because he's been his disciple for so long. He's able to deal with Rivka. First of all, he's able to understand how he can discover the proper matriarch to continue the Jewish people. And he does that through this test involving chesed, kindness, the essential attribute which the house of Abraham is built on. He's able to deal with Rivka in a way that once he discovers that attribute within her, he seizes that moment, he endorses it, and she can see firsthand in the most pure way that she's being chosen for no other reason other than that her essence is to be loved and cherished and to be ever more part of the Jewish people. And then he has to deal with the family, who on a spiritual level are very distant from everything we're talking about. And hence, there are certain details that go unmentioned and certain facts that are reshuffled so that it can be absorbed and understood at the level in which her family is. And this is the way a person can impact the world. This is the reason why Abraham was the example of a person who could impact, who could be the father of many nations, because he was able to not just see things from his own perspective, but understand as an educator and as a guide and as a person who's devoted to uplifting the people around him, what will talk to them the most. And that's what this section of the Torah is all about. It's unlocking these secrets of what it means to carry forward a legacy. It doesn't mean I have my ideas, and if I yell at you long enough, or if I repeat them often enough, you're going to get on board with me. It means I have to find the wisdom and the understanding, first of all, the depth of understanding of what Judaism is all about, and continue to develop my own understanding. And then when I interact with other people, to try to meet people where they are, my children, my spouse, whoever it is, and place in front of them opportunities for them to grow based on who and where they stand at this moment, so that they can really become great people. And they can a Rivka coming from the house in Haran, which is worshiping idols, can unlock the potential inside of her to become the matriarch of the Jewish people and to play such a critical role in how the future history of the Jewish people unfold. And I would just say in conclusion, to try to hold these ideas together a little bit more. In Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 2, Mishnah 4, it says, Aseh ritzono ki ritzoncha. It says that when we're striving to understand or to fulfill God's will, we have to take cognizance of the fact that we can ultimately not fully comprehend or even significantly comprehend the totality of God's will. So what do? As we understand God's will, we try to make it our own. We try to become subsumed in fulfilling that will of God, and that's the engine for spiritual growth. That's why Eliezer's name is not mentioned here, because he's the paradigm of a person who could have arrived into the place of Haran with 10 camel loads of jewelry and wealth, and he could have presented himself, I am the grand vizier, and I'm here to offer a shidduch to your daughter. But because his only goal was to fulfill the vision that Avram had, which was as humanly correct as representing the vision that God has for humanity. So he was completely subsumed in that task. Therefore, his name doesn't even appear. He's just referred to constantly, Eved Abraham, Eved Abraham, Anochi, I am the servant of Abraham, because for him to do this level of work in the world, and for him to bring about the continuity of the Jewish people, that's what was required of him. To the greatest extent possible, that's what's required of us. And hence, through these wrinkles in the story, and through understanding these discrepancies, and through putting aside whatever cynicism or quickness we would say to sell the Torah short, but by embracing these details, we come away with a lofty, deep understanding of how it is that we can become agents and representatives of God, so to speak, and raise up our will to coincide with his will and to fulfill the purpose of the world. Thank you.